We are now in our fourth and last piece of the axial skeleton lecture, and we're going to talk about the thoracic cage, right? So the thoracic cage is going to include the sternum, which is the part in the middle here, and then the ribs that connect to it. Okay, so let's start with those ribs. For the ribs, here would be a rib. For the ribs, you have the head, and this part right here that's a little bit lumpy, that's going to be the head. And then the head is going to articulate with the vertebrae. So this part right here, this is going to articulate with the costal cartilage, which will then connect to the sternum. So this is just generally called the sternal end. Okay, so the kind of part that looks like it's been chopped in half, that's the sternal end there. And then the lumpier side is the head. Now just kind of further along next to the head, this right here would be the tubercle. Okay, so head is going to be a bulbous end. That's a head. And the tubercle, if you hopefully remember, is a rough, medium-sized bump. Okay, and when we say medium-sized, we mean relative to the whole bone. So rough, medium-sized bump, this would be the tubercle. Head, tubercle, sternum end. Part in the middle would be the body. Okay, so let's look at how those bones would articulate. So remember that the rib cage is only in the thoracic region, so it's going to articulate specifically with a thoracic vertebrae. And so on here, remember, this is the transverse process. This is the body of the vertebrae. And so the way that they would connect is that the head of the rib, which would be this part right here, that is going to articulate with the body, and the tubercle, which is that little rough bump kind of coming off nearby the head, that's going to articulate with the transverse process right there. Okay, so the head of the rib will articulate with the body of the thoracic vertebrae, and the tubercle of the rib is going to articulate with the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so I do think it's important that you understand how the bones connect together when they articulate. Okay, so let's talk about some of the atypical ribs. Remember, atypical, whenever you see an A in front of a word, it just means it's not whatever comes after it, so it's not normal, not typical. So when we look at it, let's start with this one here. This one here, this is a strange looking rib. This right here is the very first rib. This is rib 1. And the very first rib right here, what you kind of feel it underneath your clavicle there. This you can tell the difference because let's look at them. Okay, so when you look at it from the side, it's still nice. It's flatter and it's much broader. So this right here, hopefully you can be able to distinguish and identify. This one is rib 1. It doesn't look normal, but it still does have the head and it still does have the tubercle. Okay, so this kind of weird fat looking one here, that's rib 1. And the other thing I want you to know is for the ribs, you have 7 true ribs. And what we mean by true ribs is that they have a direct connection to the sternum. So a true rib just means that that rib directly connects to the sternum. So 1 through 7, if you look, follow 7, it comes up, here's the costal cartilage, and then it connects to the sternum directly. Then we have 8 through 12, those are false ribs, and they're called false ribs because they either don't connect directly, it's an indirect connection, or they don't connect at all. Okay, so 8 through to 10, so 8, 9, and 10 here. You see how instead of being able to follow it all the way back to the sternum, you can only follow it up into the costal cartilage of rib number 7. Okay, so it's not directly connected, it has an indirect connection to the sternum, and so that is false. Now, these last two here, ribs 11 and 12, they have no connection at all, so they get an additional name, and that's called a floating rib. Okay, so let's look at how that affects their structure. So typically on a rib, you have a very blunt kind of square end where it connects to the costal cartilage. Okay, so this is showing you the costal cartilage. It kind of connects like, oh, it's upside down from the other side. It connects like that. So it would have a very blunt square end. Now for the ones that are the floating ribs, so 11 and 12, when you look at the ends of those, the sternal ends of those, they don't connect to the sternum, and so they're going to have a different shape. They create like a pointier shape. So this one right here, this would be rib 12, and I know this is rib 12 from the size of it, but also because it has that pointy end, and I know that this is a floating rib. Okay, so it has a different end to the rib because it does not have any connection to the sternum, no connection to costal cartilage. Now, one thing I want to be very, very clear on is that term floating rib means that it does not connect to the sternum, but it still is connected to the vertebrae, right? So it's not completely floating out in nothingness. The only bone in our body that has no bone articulations would be the hyoid bone. It's still connected. It's just only connected to the vertebrae. So on an exam, if I asked you to explain that term, don't tell me it has no connections. It just means it doesn't connect to the sternum. It still connects to the vertebrae in the back. Okay, so those are floating ribs. And so if I asked you, well, why do they not have a pointy end? You would explain to me that it is a floating rib and it doesn't connect with the sternum, only the vertebrae in the back. Okay, that brings us to the sternum. Here is my sternum here. The sternum has 3 different regions. This top region here is the manubrium, and I like to think of it as making an M shape at the top. See how it kind of looks like an M shape to me? Well, that does to me. That's the manubrium. M is for manubrium, and then right there, that's the boundary. So this part right here, what I call a region, this is the body of the sternum. Okay, the body of the sternum. And then this part right here that kind of sticks off at the end, that's called the xiphoid process. But notice that the xiphoid process is spelled with an X, not a Z. Okay, so manubrium here, body there, xiphoid process at the end. Okay, for the manubrium here, there are 3 little notches at the top. The top one here, you can actually you can find that yourself, that little pit when you push at the top of your sternum. That right there, this is called the jugular notch right there. Okay, and then on the side of that, these 2 notches on the side, those are called the clavicular notches. Why do you think they're called the clavicular notches? That's where the clavicles are going to articulate with the sternum. So we have the jugular notch in the middle and then the clavicular notch on each side, where both of the clavicles come and articulate with the sternum. Now on the body here, that is where you're going to get what are called costal facets. And those costal facets, remember, a facet is a very shallow, kind of smooth area for articulations. That's because that's where the costal cartilage, which is this stuff right here, that's going to attach to the ribs. Okay, so costal is related to ribs. Okay, so the costal facets attach to the costal cartilage, which connect the ribs onto the sternum. Okay, so those are going to be found along the body of the ribs, and they're just named, 1 through 7 because of those are the ribs that they connect to. Okay, last little piece I want to talk about CPR. Okay, so if you do have to do CPR. The most important thing is you really want to get the placement of your hands correct. So your goal is this fat part, this broad part of the body. That's going to be the most substantial part. That's where you want to place your weight when you're doing CPR. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, put your hands, interlace your hands like this. Okay, and that's going to give you plenty of thrust as you push on the body. Okay, so what they're showing you right here is you want to make sure that you're good, like 2 fingers above, so you can find the sternal angle where the body connects to the xiphoid process. Make sure you're above that, and you want to push on the body of the sternum. Okay, you want to be careful because if you're not correctly oriented, the xiphoid process can break off and puncture the lungs, or puncture the lungs is a big problem, or the ribs could break. If you're too far lateral, you can snap the costal cartilage or snap the bones of the ribs, and those can also puncture the ribs, right? So you want to be right as far in the middle onto the body as possible, and just do compressions. If you're not trained, you want to just do the compression part, not the breathing part, because the most important thing is that you get the rhythm correct. What you're going for is 100 beats per minute, which is staying alive. Just keep pushing and pushing, and until you get help. Okay, so body right there. Okay, that's the last of it. Quick reminder, have fun. It could be fun. It is a lot, but it could be fun as well. Just so have fun if you want to have fun. Bye-bye.